Welcome to Backwoods Teacher. Today we're going to talk about a very special piece of history that is in our neighborhood, and that is the LST 325. The LST 325 is a doorway to the story of America in World War II. The LST 325 is a World War II era ship located in lovely Evansville, Indiana. The name LST stands for Landing Ship Tank. It's unique because these ships were something like the semi-trucks of the ocean. They were workhorses, and they were often forgotten. The actual LST found down in Evansville, the 325, was actually rescued by former crew members. It had been sold and resold several times until it ultimately wound up in Greece, where these crew members went and rescued it, and now it is available for you young people to go check it out and take tours. These ships were never known by any kind of special name, just by their numbers, and they weren't named like battleships. These ships had to transport troops, tanks, and other equipment. They made dozens of trips across the Atlantic and Pacific to supply troops and equipment in all theaters of war. The story of the ship is the story of Americans in World War II. Before 1941, America was officially neutral and isolationist. The country was trying to stay out of the war. The memories of the First World War were still fresh in the minds of Americans. We were coming out of the Great Depression and did not want to take the risk of getting involved and enmeshed in another European conflict. As a result, though, America did not have enough troops trained or adequate equipment. We were behind and unprepared for the war. On top of that, the Axis, Germany, Japan, and I guess Italy, had taken over vast amounts of territory. They had quite a head start. If you look at this map, it shows that they were rapidly taking over areas, and they were basically surrounding the U.S. in a sense. In order to fight, America would first need to transport troops long distances and then supply and then resupply those troops. So it's kind of a key idea is that this war, is often thought of only as being the D-Day invasion, but there was a great deal of support and effort from everyone from engineers like the Seabees to the cooks on the ships to the people that loaded the ships to get things ready for this war. Okay, the war really begins with the Pacific Theater, and that means, when we talk about theater, that means an area where the war is fought, not where you go to see movies. All right, Japan had been at odds with the U.S. increasingly since Admiral Perry had forced Japan to open their doors to the Western world. In the 1800s, the U.S. Admiral Perry had visited with a naval destroyer and basically aimed a large gun at Japan and said, "It's time for you to trade." So this was kind of a threatening motion. Japan was poor in natural resources. They had lots of skill in making things, lots of skilled generals, but they did not have the resources to build the weapons and things that they wanted to. So they formed an alliance, and this alliance was called the Axis. They had their eyes on Indochina, and they wanted to take resources from that area. Admiral Yamamoto, who was educated, oddly enough, in America, planned to attack the U.S. His plan involved a feint to Alaska. That means like a fake. They were going to attack the Aleutian Islands and then attack Pearl Harbor. The U.S. had been limiting Japan's strategic materials. They had been limiting things like petroleum and steel. They were practicing were practicing a Lend-Lease program where we would lend the British we would lend them destroyers and other equipment, and they in turn would lease us naval bases. We froze Japan's assets. That means we locked down their bank accounts. Douglas Macarthur, as you learned about from the bonus army, he was in charge of the Army of the Philippines. And it was believed that with Macarthur there, nothing could go wrong. He was kind of like the Peyton Manning of his day, but then he turns out to be the Tom Brady of his day. And then he turns back into the Peyton Manning of his day, and then by the Korean War, he turns into somebody else. Anyway, so Congress eventually declares war on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S., as I said, was isolationist and neutral, tried to stay out of the war. Part of this stemmed also from U.S. overconfidence. The U.S. was very overconfident that nothing would happen because of the great distance of the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic, that no one would be able to cross either one of those distances and attack our mighty country. There's also a little bit of racism involved in that the U.S. believed that they were far superior to the Japanese. The Japanese couldn't fly. The Japanese couldn't plan. They had poor eyesight. These are all very stupid racist ideas, and they resulted in overconfidence on the part of the U.S. and the U.S. getting caught in a very bad position at Pearl Harbor. The sentiment of isolationism can be seen in these different groups that came up. There's the Fight for Freedom Committee, there's the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, and there's the America First Committee. So there were these three committees that, there were three committees that reflected the American opinions on the war at that time. Okay, this is the Uss Arizona Memorial. It is still around in Hawaii today, and that is the remains of the USS Arizona. Many of the sailors were trapped on it as it sunk, and they died horribly drowning. And the memorial can be seen from the air as you fly over, as you can see from this photo. The naval base at Pearl Harbor was believed to be protected by the geography because Pearl Harbor is volcanic, and so there's like these mountains and these narrow bays. They had all the ships tucked in there neatly, and they assumed that the Japanese would not be able to get there. But they were not only able to get there, they were able to plan ahead of time and get reconnaissance, which is a big word for spying, and they had people spy, and they were able to get a sense of where all the ships were. So this is a Japanese aircraft carrier, which is en route. I think at this point it was 9 hours from Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese developed the idea of the aircraft carrier while the Americans were clinging to the idea of the destroyer. The aircraft carrier is essentially a floating airport, and it was a good switch by Admiral Yamamoto to make the decision to use this because it allowed them to extend their striking capability. The air attacks on Pearl Harbor came in different waves. Some of them came in directly, somewhat low. Some of them came in high. They dropped torpedoes and they strafed the ground, not quite as excitingly as you saw in the movie Pearl Harbor, but in a similar fashion. These are images of the ships, and this is a rather drastic and kind of famous image of the petroleum burning out of the ships and the destruction that was caused. Okay, out of consequences of Pearl Harbor, American ships and aircraft were destroyed, and this set America behind drastically. We already had a limited naval and army equipment and Air Force, and so when this attack took place, it reduced that even more. Over 3,000 lives were lost. That's something to keep in mind, that in one day, in one set of hours, 3,000 lives were lost. And the war has not even started. So this is something to keep in mind when we talk about the atomic bomb later. On average, a destroyer takes 2 years to build. So each of those destroyers that has to be built would take that long to build. Even if they were built simultaneously, it's still going to take a while for the U.S. to get the defenses back up. The fact that our country was able to is testimony to the work ethic that used to exist and hopefully still does. Something you should know is that the famous speech by Franklin Roosevelt that motivated our country came on this as a result of this event. And if you ever hear the words, "Today is a day which will live in infamy," or something to that effect, that is FDR's speech after Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle air raids followed this event, and that's something else we will learn about. Another example of American ingenuity and bravery. Japanese American internment camps or concentration camps were set up. So there were Japanese who were sort of assumed to be terrorists or connected to spies or traitors, and assumed to be connected to Japan. Obviously, some had been because they had knowledge of the naval base, but it should be kept in mind that there had been many Japanese Americans who had been here for generations and were engaged in American occupations such as farming, and they were quite innocent, and they lost their property, were locked up, and they were not compensated for this. And it's something of a shameful chapter on the part of our government. But that's what government does. It overreacts and usually slaps the wrong person. Okay, another result of this is that FDR declares war on Germany. You might ask, well, why declare war on Germany? Well, they were allies with Japan, and it was assumed that if Japan was attacking us, Germany would. This also marks the beginning of the atomic bomb. The Bataan Death March takes place after this, because right after Japan attacks the base at Pearl Harbor, they attack the Philippines. Alaska was actually bombed as well. Okay, so this is the situation in 1941, and as we said earlier, America's in a position where there's a need to send troops in multiple directions, and it's pretty amazing when you look at that, the number of troops that needed to be sent and the distances that needed to be traveled along with equipment. It was a pretty daunting task. So back to the LST. These ships were marvels of construction. The Americans were not alone in building them. Some were built in Canada, some in England, but they were just huge moving semi-trailers. They're kind of like the naval equivalent of a C-130. Okay, let's take a look at some of these things. So America goes from being a sleeping giant, an isolationist sleeping giant, to an industrial war machine. And some of the outcomes of this are that the Great Depression ends, women enter the workforce, and start construction on things like the LST-325 and other ships and planes and tanks and many other things. The war effort would not have been won without the help of American women who went to work welding and doing previously masculine jobs. War bonds were also sold. So this basically gets us out of the Depression, and that's another topic, is whether the war got us out of the Depression or the New Deal did. Over here, the LST and 325 and other ships carried fuel, supplies, ammo, jeeps, tanks, planes, and all these things had to be made and shipped. Obviously, Marines, sailors, pilots, mechanics, medics, nurses, cooks, and more had to be shipped overseas. So you have to keep in mind that hundreds of thousands of troops have to be sent over, and support staff have to be sent over, as well as people brought back, as well as prisoners brought back. So these ships were pretty amazing. They carried stuff and people back and forth. The LST-325 in particular made 42 trips across the Atlantic. It went to North Africa, Italy, and was involved in the Normandy D-Day invasion, and carried such notable persons as General George S. Patton, quite possibly one of the most amazing American men to ever live. We need Patton back today. Moving right along. The LSTs had to carry troops. They had a crew of 120 but could carry 100